What's up everyone, my name's Justin. I recently wrote the MCAT where I was able to score a 523 or the 99th percentile with the following section breakdown. Today I'll be going over how I studied for the MCAT, what resources I used, and some tips I have for each section of the MCAT. Hopefully you find this video helpful, but remember what worked for me might not work for you, so try some strategies out and see what works best for you. So let's first start with my overall study schedule. So this was my second time writing the MCAT. I wrote the MCAT for the first time 2 years ago and scored a 513, but I chose to rewrite it due to my low CAR score. Both times I studied for the MCAT, I studied for around 8 weeks total full time. And while this is on the shorter side, I did feel pretty confident in my background in the sciences due to my undergrad degree, which led me to this shorter time frame. So when deciding for how long to study for the MCAT, well, that answer completely depends on your background knowledges in the sciences, and if you've taken courses such as biology, biochemistry, physics, chemistry, or psychology and sociology. It's just like if someone was wondering how long they might need to train to run a marathon, and that answer is going to completely depend on if they're used to running maybe 10Ks or if they've never even run a 5K in their life. So it's important to first assess where you are content-wise so you can decide how long you might need to dedicate to studying. But in general, if you have a solid content background, then 2 months or maybe more comfortably 3 months of full-time studying is likely enough to study for the MCAT. Overall, I split my studying into 2 phases. The first phase was my major content review phase, which lasted about 2 or 3 weeks or just under half my studying time. And then for the rest, I dedicated most of my time to doing practice questions. And this is except for CARs, which I did practice every single day throughout my studying. So you'll notice I didn't really spend a ton of time on the content review, and that's because I wanted to prioritize doing practice questions for a couple of reasons. First off, the MCAT is so much about being able to figure out how to answer their style of questions, rather than just memorizing the content like you might be used to from your classes. And second, I really wanted to prioritize practice questions so that I could identify my strengths and weaknesses so I knew where to target my content review instead of just going everywhere aimlessly. I scheduled my studying around the 5 AMC practice exams, where I would plan to do 1 full exam per week, spend 1 day per week reviewing the exam, as well as taking 1 day completely off from MCAT studying. Alright, so how did I tackle the content review phase for my studying? Well, for biology, biochemistry, physics, and chemistry, I actually used my course notes from university as I felt I was most comfortable with those. But I did supplement a little bit using the Princeton review textbooks, and I just decided to use those because my brother actually had them from his time writing the MCAT, but I've also heard good things about the Kaplan textbooks, and I don't think it really matters which one you use. For certain topics, I also looked up some Khan Academy YouTube videos, as well as just other random YouTube videos for some topics that I wasn't as familiar with. For the psychology and sociology section of the MCAT, I read through the entire Princeton Review textbook on that topic, and I decided to make my own flashcards, and then I basically just spammed those flashcards over the next couple months to solidify my knowledge for that section. Personally, I didn't use any Anki decks or any other flashcards to study the science sections, but I know many other people do find success with that approach, and there are many really great pre-made decks that you can find online. So as I mentioned, I really didn't spend a ton of time nailing down the content too exactly, because I'd rather start the practice questions where I could identify the areas that I was comfortable with and identify the holes in my knowledge. So my next tip is not to be afraid to start practice questions too early, because in all honesty, you're never going to know everything on the exam and you don't need to in order to get a really great score. So it's better to just start your practice questions even if you don't feel 100% confident on everything. That being said, you do want to make sure you do have a solid content base, and if you start practice questions and you find that over half of the questions you don't even know the content, you're probably going to need to spend more time on content before starting the rest of your practice questions. So as I mentioned, practice questions were really the most important resource that I used in order to get good at answering the MCAT style questions. And the main 2 resources I use for practice questions are UWorld, which is an online database of over 2,000 questions that really mimic the style of the AMC. In addition, I did use all the official AMC online practice material. So those are the question banks, the section banks, the practice tests, and all that material. So while doing practice questions is really important for your studying, it's also extremely important that you review these questions to find out exactly why you got a question wrong so you can improve the next time. When I reviewed my practice questions, I found it helpful to split the questions that I missed into 2 categories. So the first category would be a simple content error that if I would have known that small piece of content, I would have got the question right. So maybe this was a question just simply asking what the next intermediate in the Krebs cycle was, and I didn't know that, so that's the reason I got the question wrong. And on the other hand, there were certain questions that it wasn't related to content, it was more so my ability to either extract information from the passage, either be able to interpret the data from the passage, or mistakes like that. If the question I got wrong was simply due to content, I didn't waste too much time reviewing it. I simply just made an Anki flashcard with that content piece of information. So maybe what is the next intermediate in the Krebs cycle, so I remember it for next time. And this is a really great way to save time when reviewing questions, because you'll probably be doing hundreds of practice questions, and reviewing them can take a lot of time. But if you're able to identify the mistakes you make that are simply content, you can just make a simple flashcard so you don't have to waste time on understanding how you got that question wrong. However, the other category of mistakes that you might be making, such as not reading the passage correctly, maybe you have no idea where to go with the question, maybe you got a calculation wrong, maybe you ran out of time, all these reasons could contribute to mistakes, and these are the types of questions that you need to spend a little bit more time understanding why you got that question wrong and what you can do to make sure you don't get it wrong next time. Once you see where the mistakes are coming from, you can develop strategies to directly tackle these mistakes. So maybe you need to spend more time reading the passage to extract some information. Maybe you need to spend less time because you're getting too overwhelmed in the details. Maybe you need to practice reading graphs and understanding how to extract conclusions from data.
For example, if you keep getting calculation questions wrong, or you get them right but they take a lot of time, then maybe spend half an hour practicing calculations. And here's an example of how you might improve calculation questions. This question might seem hard to do without a calculator, but using rounding and scientific notation can make it really easy. So when I saw a number like 148,104, I would automatically round that to 1.5 times 10 to the 6, and so on with the other numbers. Then it just becomes a simple calculation of 1.5 times 4 divided by 3 and some quick exponent rules to get 2 times 10 to the power of 6. Now for another example. If you keep getting data interpretation questions wrong, you can practice generating conclusions from graphs. Practice identifying the independent and dependent variables and talk yourself through a graph, starting simple and then working up. So here the obvious conclusion is that as variable x goes up, variable y goes up in a linear fashion. Here's an example of a simple knockout model, which the MCAT loves. Here you can say when gene A is knocked out, variable y is decreased. But now if we add multiple genes, we can modify our conclusion. If we have either gene A or gene B, then we have full levels of variable y, suggesting that having one of the genes can compensate for a knockout of the other. On the actual MCAT, you'll see more complicated gene names, but don't get lost in this alphabet soup. This is really just the same process before. Only now we can conclude that if we have either gene ABXQ7 or PTG4, then we have full cell survival, but if both genes are missing, then cell survival drops significantly. So these are a couple of examples of how identifying your challenges can help you figure out what strategies to use to improve.
So the same process definitely applies to the cars section of the MCAT, obviously without the content review involved, but to explain fully how I was able to increase my score by 6 points, that's likely going to take a whole other video where I can go more into detail on my advice and tips. After I finished my content review phase, I would spend about 4 days a week just doing practice questions and reviewing them in the ways that I earlier explained. Also during these days, I'd spend some time doing some quick content review, but in a more targeted approach on specific topics that I was having difficulty with. So let's say on the week before, on the full-length tests, I got a lot of questions wrong related to optics or physics, so then I'd maybe spend an hour one day really hammering out the optics section. So overall, I did practice questions to get used to the MCAT style questions. I also used them to identify my gaps in content, and then I would spend a few hours each day reviewing those specific topics that I had difficulty with. These practice questions were also really important for improving my speed and my stamina in doing the questions, because the MCAT, it's super long obviously, so you're going to want to make sure that you get comfortable with answering practice questions for a long amount of time so you can maintain the same level of focus for over 7 hours. Now let's get into a couple of quick tips that I have for each section on the MCAT. So for the chemistry and physics section of the MCAT, I have a couple quick tips. The first is making sure that you either make yourself a formula sheet or find one online and really just commit those formulas to memory, because you're going to get a ton of marks on the real test just by knowing the formulas and knowing how to do calculation questions quickly. Secondly, you can get a lot of easy marks on this section from simple topics that really repeat themselves a ton on this test. So one example might be some lab techniques, such as knowing the different type of chromatographies, and if you know these, all the questions, they really become the same. For the biology and biochemistry section of the MCAT, make sure you know all the amino acids like the back of your hand, because there's so many questions that come up relating to the amino acids, and if you know them all, you can get them all right. And not only can you get them right, but you can make a question that might take 2 minutes just take about 10 seconds, which can save you a ton of time on the MCAT. For this section, I also recommend getting really confident with data interpretation questions, because they appear tons of times on the MCAT and they all really follow the same formula. So if you're able to read a passage, identify the variables, and then extract conclusions from the data, you can answer all of these questions like no big deal. For the psychology and sociology section of the MCAT, obviously it's important to memorize all the terms and definitions, and you can use a textbook or the shortened Khan Academy notes found online. But one specific tip I have for this section is trying to come up with an example that fits a psychology or sociology term, instead of just purely memorizing it. Let's take one example: the fundamental attribution error. Sure, you could just memorize the definition, but this might make it a bit confusing when it comes to the actual test. So instead, maybe try coming up with an example. So the example that I always learned and use was, let's say you're driving on the road and a driver cuts you off. Now you're probably thinking, well, that guy's just a jerk. But you're not thinking maybe he's going to the hospital, or maybe he has a really important reason for speeding. And this example can really connect the dots on that terminology. And if you come up with an example for many of these terms, it can be easier to answer questions. And finally, for cars, while it's difficult to summarize advice really quickly, one quick piece I have is to really try treating the passage and its author as your friend and not as your enemy. It's really easy to start reading a Cars passage and think, this sucks, I hate this, I don't want to read about some 14th century painting. Trust me, we all have been there, I've been there, you've been there. We don't want to read more than half the stuff that's in the Cars section. But if you go into it with a mentality like that, there's no way you're going to read the Cars passage, there's no way you're going to understand what's going on, and there's no way you're going to get a good score. So instead, try going into it with a positive mindset. Read that first sentence, read that 14th century painting, that poem, whatever you don't care about, and convince yourself that you really, really do. Because I guarantee that it's going to help you understand the rest of the passage, which is extremely important for answering the Cars questions. So there's a couple mental cues that I tended to use during the Cars section. So first off, maybe I'd read the first sentence and maybe it's about, again, like a 14th century painting. And instead of thinking, oh, I hate that painting, I'd read, oh wow, let's see what this guy finds so interesting about the painting. Trying to treat him like a friend. Sometimes I would even go as far as to thinking I'm on some kind of date with my dream girl and she's telling me about this painting that I don't care about, but I need to pretend like I care about it, because how am I gonna get her attention? How am I gonna get that second date with her? So I read that first sentence, I read the rest of the passage like my life depends on it. Like I really need to know what's going on. So that's a really quick summary of how I studied for the MCAT, what resources I used, as well as some general tips that I have for studying. Aside from the test-specific tips, it's also really important to stay strong mentally. The MCAT is really, really hard. Anyone that's written that can tell you that. You're gonna have days where you wanna study, but you're gonna have days where you don't wanna study. You're gonna have days where you're flying through practice questions, getting great scores, and you're gonna have days where you're just not. And even people with great scores have really off days. But it's not how many challenges you face, it's how you respond to the challenges. Are you going to be the person that just sits down and just gives up when you're having an off day? Or are you going to be the one that gets up the next day, learns from your mistakes, and comes back even harder? If you're having trouble staying motivated, try to remind yourself, why are you taking the MCAT? I mean, obviously it's probably to become a doctor, but why is that so important to you? Picturing the final goal can make it really easy to push through the small days. What I like to do every night before I went to bed is picture myself opening a great score. For me, it was the Cars score that I was looking for, and I would just picture myself getting a 130 on Cars every single night. And that set me in a great positive mindset to get at it the next day, even if I didn't want to. Be the person that pushes through the struggle, pushes through the tough times, and comes back even stronger, because I guarantee it'll be all worth it in the end when you finally reach your dream score and you become a doctor. So that's the end of the video. I'm happy to give more tips or advice in future videos, as well as answer any questions that you might have. But if this video helped you at all, please drop a like and consider subscribing to see any future videos, and also let me know what type of videos I might need to make in the future to best help you in your studying. Good luck!